Great. So it's great to be starting a new Chumash with a returning teacher in Dr. Aviva Zornberg. Her volume here is called The Particulars of Rapture, Reflections on Exodus. And, we will reacquaint ourselves with her style as it varies significantly from Rav Meidan's, even though in equally significant ways they are both very attached to the medieval commentaries and to Midrash, and in a sense each of their analyses and compositions can be thought of as modern Midrashic takes. She incorporates a lot more literary criticism and philosophy than Rav Meidan, just different styles and different kind of source texts for their analysis, and also similarly to Rav Meidan, there is a degree of continuity between the different sections. Even Rav Meidan's different essays on a parashah sometimes will interrelate, and certainly over the course of the book, but also they can be studied in smaller sections and units. And with Dr. Zornberg, each parashah has kind of one overarching thematic title and subsections within it that partially stand on their own and partially interrelate. So every slice that we'll study partially, thanks, Mom. Every slice that we'll study will be incomplete. It will both stand on its own a little bit and also, relate to things we won't have a chance to see that may have come before or after it. This time we're going to start from the beginning of Shemot. And it's, of course, in English. So I don't have to freestyle translate, except insofar as her writing requires some project of translation because it's as dense and challenging, and that we'll sort of do together as we go. I would say that the sort of things, just to forecast what stood out to me from this essay was, and this is true with Rav Meidan also, sometimes they will cite Mefarshim, classical Mefarshim, whose take on the topic I had not seen before, and her kind of introduction of the Sforno's comments in the beginning of Shemot were new to me, but consistent with the Sforno's introduction to the book of Shemot, which I had studied once before, and also sort of stood out in its unique approach. And here she really shows from some of his early comments how that follows through, and a couple of key literary terms in the beginning of Shemot that stand out that I think will open our eyes to closer reading of the text. So this is called Shemot, the Mirror of Redemption, from this Parashat Shavua, the first 5 chapters of the book. And the first section here, which we won't even do all of, is called Fit for Redemption, the Human Context. And it starts with Israel and Egypt, the Mosaic distinction. Here we go. In Jewish tradition, the Exodus from Egypt marks the birth of the Israelite nation and religion. Conceptually, it marks a basic separation between cultures, a distinction between true and false in religion that Jan Assmann in Moses the Egyptian calls the Mosaic distinction. The space severed or cloven by this distinction is the space of Western monotheism. Okay, so somehow the notion of the departure of the Jewish people from the Israelite people from Egypt, and in that moment, then the differentiation and distinction between Israelites and Egyptians, biblically is presented to us, and rabbinically even further is developed for us as kind of the emergence of Western monotheism, and this kind of that which is led by Moses, then becomes called this Mosaic distinction. Certainly, we've heard Rav Avi speak about this many times. Kind of that a central theme across the whole Tanakh is kind of the differentiation, or almost the setting up as polar opposites of Israel and Egypt, and the kind of most basic message. And we've seen this in Dr. Zornberg also on Vayikra. She raised this in one of the essays that we saw, kind of the idea of almost the definition of what it means to be a Yisraeli is somehow set in total opposition to what it means to be a Mitzri. And so, being born out of both the in part and the out of part, Egypt is sort of essential to our self-definition. How is this distinction conceived? What are the symbolic values attached to each of the two figures, Israel and Egypt? Underlying the issues of truth and falsehood The Mosaic distinction in its more profound ethical dimensions attributes psychological and spiritual values to each figure. The stakes of redemption, of birth to a full selfhood, are large. The issue is not narrowly theological, but rather is related to all that makes individual and collective life fruitful or sterile. So even though, the Mosaic distinction is called the space of Western monotheism, she wants to point out that it's about a lot more than just theology. It's somehow about the becoming the people Israel, if I'm understanding it correctly, which is about becoming, in a sense, fruitful. And she's going to circle back to that because of how much the opening plays on those. The opening of the book of Shemot plays on these themes. So I think while she means something more broad than fruitful or sterile, she's choosing those metaphors very intentionally. As usual, we're going to get 4 to 6 paragraphs in before it starts to hold together a little bit. Particularly in the Midrashic sources and in Hasidic texts, questions as to the inner meaning of redemption, right, which redemption here means the full birth of Israel and the becoming of Israel as distinct from Egypt, generate a construction of Egypt as the world of constriction, paralysis, and silence. Right. So what it means to be redeemed from Egypt is to be freed from this Egyptian environment, which, again, in Midrashic and Hasidic sources, is presented to us as constriction, paralysis, and silence. The pun often found in Hasidic writings associates Mitzrayim, Egypt, with Mitzarim, same letters, different nikudot, different vocalization. Where Mitzrayim is Egypt, Mitzarim is straits. So the whole idea of Yetziat Mitzrayim becomes about not just going forth from the geographic place, not just becoming a nation, but freeing ourselves from this environment, which was all about, as she said, constriction, paralysis, and silence. Egypt becomes a country of the spirit constricted and, in a real sense, inescapable. This is the fundamental issue of the Exodus: how to be redeemed when Egypt, that enervating soulscape, has one in its pincer grip. From such a perspective, Israel in Egypt cannot be redeemed. No separation is possible. In the same way as, in terms of mythic thought, the baby held in the womb cannot be born, must remain monstrously, but all too plausibly, immobilized forever. So somehow, at the first glance, the definition of Egypt is so confining that sort of the notion of becoming redeemed from it, being able to exit it, feels impossible. How could redemption even happen? It's sort of against the nature of what it means to be in Egypt. It's not just a circumstantial condition of having gotten, been there and become enslaved. It's something innate to being in Egypt. The peculiar suffering of such inertia haunts the Midrashic accounts of the time before the Exodus. No slave ever escaped from Egypt. A quote from the Mechilta, from the Midrash, right? So it's certainly, it's an I don't remember seeing that Midrash. It's an interesting statement. And here she's recruiting it to say, this develops the idea, that Egypt is truly this constraining place, that it's not just that the Jewish people couldn't go free, but not a single slave ever escaped. What makes release possible, or in Midrashic language, what makes the people fit for redemption? How do they develop themselves to actually kind of begin to become the nature of people who could get out of the Egypt of constriction and constraint? What's the turning point in the history of this unarticulated misery? And what, again, in Midrashic language, is the secret of redemption? Okay. I'm going to keep going because we've got a lot of background building up to do to get to, I think, the especially good stuff. And they swarmed, blessing or critique. Exodus, the book of exile and redemption. This is capitalized, and the footnote takes us to the fact that this is the title of the book that the Ramban gives, Nachmanides, in his introduction to the book of Shemot, calls it the book of Galut v'Hageula Mimenu, exile and the redemption from it. That's his sort of description, his title, essentially, for Shemot. So it begins with a list of names. And now she quotes from the first 6 psukim, right? Ve'ela Shemot b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma, Eit Yaakov Ishu uveito ba'u. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Yaakov, each coming with his household. Get a list of the tribes. The total number of persons that were of Yaakov's issue came to 70, Yosef already being in Egypt. Yosef died, and all his brothers and all that generation. These are the dead, listed to tell the reader that they are no more. And in fact, this is what Rashi comments, in Rashi's first comment. There's a classic point that's been pointed out about Rashi, that his first comment on each of the 5 books of the Torah, the first Rashi on each of them somehow evokes or invokes the idea of the special love that God has for the Jewish people. So here he talks about the idea that the special love that God has for the Jewish people is that God didn't just count them when they were going down to Egypt alive, right? As we did already in Vayigash, when they go down with Yaakov, we get like a list of the 70 or roughly 70. But the Torah goes out of its way to count them again, essentially when they have died or as they are dying, just to show how much God loves them. Of course, the simpler shot answer is what we call resumptive repetition. We're picking up the story again after the intervening death of Yaakov and death of Yosef, and so we're kind of repeating setting the scene again as we start this new book. These are the dead, listed to tell the reader that they are no more. In Jewish tradition, the book is called the Book of Names, right? Because of we name things rabbinically often after the first significant word. So ve'eleh Shemot, these are the names. It's called the Book of Names. The reference is clearly to the names of the children of Israel, those individuals who in a moment in history went down to Egypt and died there, together with their brother Joseph, who had preceded them. What follows, however, on this meticulous listing of the dead is an explosion of life, an almost surrealistic description of the spawning of a nation, right? After the pasuk, Yosef died and all his brothers and all that generation. The next pasuk is, and the children of Israel were fruitful and swarmed and multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them, right? I think I often gloss over that kind of strong opposition, because strong contrast, because I'm just used to reading it as the narrative. And she's inviting us to pause for a moment and just see the juxtaposition of the death of a generation and then, this explosive birth and life. Nameless, faceless, these two are the children of Israel, right? So just pointing out to us that, they were called Shemot b'nei Yisrael, the sons of Israel, and then again, uvnei Yisrael, even though she translates it, I guess she's translating it because here these were literally the sons, the male sons, and now it's the broader b'nei Yisrael, but it's the same in Hebrew, right? So these two, she's sort of saying, just like the very first verse, chapter 1, verse 1, so too, chapter 1, verse 7, are also the children of Israel. How are we to read this description of their anonymous fecundity? There are two possible understandings. On the one hand, this is a celebration of fullness, of life burgeoning and uncontained. This reading would be a fulfillment of God's promise to Yaakov. Fear not to go down to Egypt, for I will make you there into a great nation. The redundant expressions of fertility have been read as denoting multiple births, healthy development, absence of fetal, infant, or adult mortality. In the Midrashic readings, there is a miraculous, even a whimsical sense of the outrageous victory of life over death. These, for instance, take the 6 expressions of fertility. They were fruitful, that's 1. Paru. They swarmed, vayishretzu, that's 2. Vayirbu, they multiplied, that's 3. Vayatzmu, they increased, that's 4. Bima'od, ma'od, very, very much, 5 and 6. There's 6 phrases here of fertility, fruitfulness, to indicate that each woman gave birth to sextuplets, right? That's a midrashic take. So just by the way, the footnote 4, where she says, in a phrase, a series of possible interpretations, she says, see Rashbam and Rashi on chapter 1, verse 7 for some of these interpretations that she's citing here. And then as well, we have the midrashic one. The affirmation of life contained in these pounding synonyms intimates in its very excess a transcendent order of meaning. Even though, sorry, one second. And here she's quoting from a Midrash in Shemot Rabbah. That's what footnote 6 tells us. Even though Yosef and his brothers died, their God did not die. But the children of Israel were fruitful and multiplied, right? So that's the Midrash's sort of interpolated phrase. We have, again, going back up, chapter 1, verse 6. Vayamot Yosef v'chol achav v'chol hador hahu. Yosef, his brothers, that whole generation died. Next verse, Uvnei Yisrael paru vayishretzu, etc. The children of Israel were fruitful and multiplied. The Midrash looks at the juxtaposition and says, God did not die. And somehow the connection to God leads from the death of a generation to the explosive, multiplication of the next generation. Right? The Midrash here wants to decipher the cascade of births not only as blessing, but as the survival of God. The generation that connects with the meaningful past is all gone, but in some way that is not fully explained here, God expresses God's undimmed vitality in the language of physical fertility. That's take number one. Remember, she said there are two possible readings of this fertility verse, chapter 1, verse 7. An alternative reading of this passage, however, would take its cue from the ambiguous expression vayishretzu. They swarmed. Only one of the, 4 or 5, 4 verbs, I guess, 6 statements, but 6 clauses or descriptions, but 4 verbs. So focusing in on this more unusual one, right? Paru, vayishretzu, vayirbu, vayatzmu. So pru or avu, those are very common ones, and yatzmu we have a little bit more. Vayishretzu may be a little less common, especially for human, proliferation. So if we focus in on that one, they swarmed. This can mean the blessing of extraordinary increase, but it connotes a reptilian fecundity, right? Going back to creation, all the creepy crawly things, that swarmed on the earth. So which introduces a bizarre note in a description of human fertility. In this second view, Vayishretzu is a repellent description for a family fallen from greatness. So this is sort of her hook into a reading that somehow, the story, literally, family of Yaakov generation has died, Yosef and his brothers, and that whole generation has died. And now we have this new generation, which is extremely, fertile and proliferating, but it's also Vayishretzu. And that tells us of something base and animalistic about it. And she's going to buttress with the reading of the Sforno. Sforno, the 16th century Italian commentator, articulates this tragic historical reading most clearly. At first, he writes there were individuals, named highly evolved persons who went down to Egypt. Immediately upon their death, names cease. What we have is masses of unindividuated, insect-like conformists, whose whole effort is to assimilate to their surroundings, and whose unconscious drive is for lemming-like suicide. Here's the quote of the Sforno. After the 70 original immigrants had died, they inclined toward the ways of shratzim, of reptiles, an uncomplimentary reference, this is her parenthetical, to the pagan nations, whose concerns are entirely this worldly, meaning it's not base in the sense of animalistic, in the sense of comparing to animals, but comparing to animals to whom the other pagan nations are also compared. So they became pagan and animalistic human in their orientation by focusing only on the things that reptiles care about, whatever you can get to eat in this world. They ran through their lives in a headlong rush toward the abyss. As she points out, again, we're not reading this Sforno in the original, so we're relying on her explanations, that here the headlong rush towards the abyss is a pun on shratzim and sheratzim, those who run. Right? We say in the Siyum liturgy, when we complete a section of learning, comparing ourselves to those to others in the world unfavorably. Anu ratzim vehem ratzim, right? Anu ratzim l'chayei haolam haba vehem ratzim li be'er shachat. We run and they run. We run to the life of the next world because of our meritorious and forward looking goals, and they run down to a pit of destruction because they're so consumed with only the pleasures or interests of this world, right? So in Vayishretzu, there's also this sense of sheratzim, of kind of running after the pleasures of the moment. This is, again, the Sforno. An existential failure is marked here. The grandchildren of Jacob have already lost their distinctiveness, their names, their sense of purpose. And as you listen, she's going to acknowledge this in a moment, but test this against our sense of what the classic description of the Jewish people in Egypt is. They have assimilated themselves entirely to the surrounding culture. One significant detail that recurs in many Midrashic sources is that the Israelites in Egypt stopped circumcising their children. The sages read this drive to assimilation as, in effect, a death wish. Ironically, as both Sforno and his Midrashic source point out, the Israelite assimilation project backfires as it turns Pharaoh against them. Having abandoned their tradition and individuality, they at least share the blame for the fact that Pharaoh no longer recognizes them as Yosef's kin, right? When we say a new Pharaoh arose who knew not Joseph, in some sense saying didn't know Joseph and couldn't even recognize Joseph's descendants because they were no longer distinctive Hebrews. They seemed like Egyptians because they had rushed to assimilate so quickly. Sforno tells a tale of justified persecution, not to exonerate Paro, but to ground events in the history of a people who have, in 2 generations, lost their claim to their own names, and whose swarming is not a token of blessing, but a symptom of alienation from that true self that even a Pharaoh will acknowledge. Sforno's reading, rooted as it is in traditional rabbinic commentaries, is deeply disturbing. For one thing, it stands against the more often quoted, certainly more consoling rabbinic sources, and I was as I read that previous paragraph, I was waiting for this moment, that declare that the children of Israel in Egypt remained essentially untouched by their environment, particularly in matters of language, naming themselves and their world, as well as in their clothing. They held to their own identity. Even on the question of circumcision, there are midrashic sources that make precisely the opposite claim, that they never totally abandoned this fundamental covenantal practice, right? So as is typically the case in, the world of midrash and commentary, we have these two totally divergent and opposite stories of the Jewish people in Israel, in Egypt. One of them is they rushed to assimilate. This is Sforno's take, and some other midrashic sources back this up. And the other is, against all odds, they retained their identity. In addition to the problem of conflicting sources, right, that we have these two opposing approaches, there's the larger question of narrative meaning. What does Sforno gain by making the story one of guilt and punishment within the evolving sense of self of the Jewish people? Surely Paro is the unmitigated villain of the piece. Surely his story is one of unwarranted, fantastical malice and cruelty against a people whose only narrated sin is their fertility. Right now, quoting Paro from verse 10, "Come, let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Else in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and leave the country," right? The only claim, quote unquote, Paro has against them is that they are increasing in number. So why is Sforno motivated to do all of this? Sforno's reading of the people swarming may seem to give some theological rationale for Israelite suffering, right? So the first guess is Sforno looks at the story and sees otherwise unjustified generations of slavery and persecution and oppression and says, I got to find a reason for this. So it must be that the Jewish people had done all these bad things to, again, not fully say deserve it, but have at least a role being worthy of some kind of punishment or retribution or recompense. But this, as we may be thinking to ourselves, is not a necessary move. For arching over most of Genesis, there is the unfulfilled decree, the gezerah, as it is often called, of God's address to Abraham. Know well, we read this on the Haggadah, in the Haggadah on the Seder night, and from the covenant between the parts, Brit Ben Abitarim, know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. So again, we ask the question when we see that, why should that be the case? But at least the Sforno doesn't have to come up with a reason why the slavery is happening, to the extent that the slavery has already been foretold to Abraham. Again, without a reason there either, but at least it's known to be expected. So why does the Sforno have to go this way? By the beginning of Exodus, the time has come for the decree to be applied. The time for alienation, for slavery, for oppression. By the way, I don't know if it's on purpose that she uses these 3 words. I assume it is. These are kind of the 3 key words in the covenant between the parts that appear in other kind of clusters and other places in Tanakh as well. Gerut, Avdut, and Inoi. alienation, that's gerut, slavery, avdut, and inoi, oppression or affliction. Those are sort of the key terms kind of that are in Brit Bein HaBetarim and that appear in other clusters as well. To this question, so why then does Sforno introduce a motif of Israelite responsibility for the suffering that is decreed? To this question, there is, of course, no unequivocal historical answer. Perhaps the value of such a question lies simply in its pointing to a choice of interpretation. Sforno, we become aware, has constructed a narrative of failure, guilt, punishment, where the biblical text seemed to give us only the facts of suffering. His choice closes off certain kinds of understanding of history, of the lives of individuals and nations. Lawrence Wexler, in his study of the nature of modern totalitarianism, calamities of exile, notes that a position that insists on asserting one's own responsibility for a given situation, quote, has heuristic value. It makes possible a future politics that otherwise might become lost in a bottomless sense of victimization and despair, right? When you say that I play a role in this, I'm responsible for this, then you give yourself a chance to not get pulled down into a narrative that always sees yourself as a victim. I think about this sometimes, to shifting gears somewhat significantly, when talking to people who, after the loss of a loved one, as is so often the case, sort of are preoccupied by decisions that they made towards the end. What if I had suggested this test? What if I had opted for this treatment or that treatment? And a social worker who worked at the Bayit, who I learned a lot from, once said to me that in talking to people about that, at some point she sort of raises for them the possibility, it's so incredibly likely, everything points to the fact that what was ahead for your loved one was essentially inevitable. But sometimes that process of going through questioning ourselves is because we want to try to assert control, even though it causes us anguish. We want to try to assert control in a situation where it's just hard to accept that actually we had very little control, that even if we had made the opposite decision, the outcome more or less would likely have been the same. But it's hard to really confront our powerlessness in the moment and also after the fact. And so sometimes that preoccupation, even though, again, it causes ourselves pain, but it gives ourselves the sense of control. And here I think he's saying a similar type of thing, that attempting to say that the Jewish people, their choices were responsible at some level for their servitude and oppression, gives us the possibility here, maybe not the illusion, maybe the real sense, of some level of control and some then therefore route to a different outcome at some point, as opposed to sort of the powerlessness, which he's talking about in a different way, this sense of victimization and despair. Concentrating on responsibility for one's own predicaments creates an emotional world in which inner growth becomes imaginable, right? Again, it's not the same framework as what I was talking about there, analogous, but not the same thing. Here, the focus is on, again, if you attribute responsibility to yourself, then maybe you have the possibility for change and doing it differently the next time around, something like that. In adopting this view of Israelite suffering, therefore, Sforno opens up different kinds of difficult kinds of understanding. He invites us to reflect on the ways in which slavery, persecution, alienation, even when they are functions of a divine edict, are generated by human beings in the freedom of their own narratives. And in the same vein, on the meanings of redemption, exodus, freedom. In doing this, he stands in a tradition of commentators who read the Exodus narrative psychologically, spiritually, from the point of view of the victim who seeks redemption in the intimate as well as the political sense, right? And here I think she's loosely also alluding to a lot of the Hasidic masters who take this story as, a national story, which also sheds light on our personal moments when we are in constriction, confinement, and we ask the question, do we have some control over the situation? If there is some way, even even recognizing that a lot of it is beyond our control, that maybe we did something to get ourselves here, or we played some role in getting ourselves here, then can we play some role in getting ourselves out? And, so I think it's a really salient, powerful, important point. As much as I'm resistant to the Sforno's reading, sort of I understand the utility of it in a certain sense. I'll just offer one other thought and then pause for questions, reactions. I think about this sometimes, in a moment of gun violence, acts, heinous acts of anti-Semitism. And on the one hand, the reaction is just to say, well, we did nothing to deserve this. We bear no responsibility. We are the victims. And so we mourn and grieve. And to suggest that we are responsible, runs that risk of blaming the victim. But maybe there is some middle ground, different in different circumstances, where we say, is there anything we could do differently to bring about a different outcome? And again, we don't want to be untruthful. There might be nothing. It might be a moment of pure victimhood. And if it is that, then it is that. But either because maybe it isn't entirely, or because of, again, that sense of putting a different framework on it, which is, can we make change? Sometimes that shifting the question, or adding the question of what is our role here, brings a different possibility of approach. Again, even if we ultimately resolve we had no role, even just by asking the question, we're taking a different approach. Let me pause here for thoughts or reactions to things so far. Yeah, Rav Scott, go for it.
I'm wondering if there's any tradition that sees that verse about the fecundity of the Israelites as being reflective of how the Egyptians see them, particularly in view of Pharaoh's comment later. Whenever I read that line, that word, Vayishritzu, I can't help but think of the propaganda during the Nazi period and how Jews were seen and viewed. And when I read that verse, that's how I've always seen it. It just makes sense to me that, as an alien population that was growing, they felt threatened. And it reflects the Egyptian view.
Yeah, great. I love that reading. It's interesting because it doesn't, we zeroed in on that word, and the rest of the verse doesn't feel that way as much. So it almost sort of feels like it's snuck as insidious anti-Semitism does. Sometimes even the victims wind up being unable to avoid adopting the framework of the perpetrators, right? So it's almost as though we could either say it, I think the way you're saying it is the text is speaking in some way from Paro's perspective, but it almost feels like
it's extreme. It's not just saying, they were fruitful and multiplied. It just continues to repeat that notion, and I don't know. That's just how it feels.
Yeah, I think it's a good reading. It reminds me also of Balak's perspective on the Jewish people. I think the language is right now, this people is gonna kind of lap up all of our surroundings like the ox, chews up all the grass, and that same kind of like animalizing, dehumanizing, expansiveness approach. I think it's a very, very good reading. Thank you. Dara, go for it.
Yeah, hi. Can you just remind us of when Sforno was writing and where he lived?
Yes, Sforno was an Italian commentator, I think 16th century. Dad, does that sound right? Yeah, 16th century Italian commentator. My father quoted him in my father's bar mitzvah speech. In my father's speech to me at my bar mitzvah, the Sforno on the menorah in the Mishkan. So it's a favored commentator in our house. But yes, so 16th century Italy. Why do you ask, Dara?
No, because sometimes, where a person is living and the historical context sometimes plays a part in, in their view and their exposition.
Yes, for sure.
I mean, I'm not, history is not my forte, so I wouldn't be able to to bring any pearls of wisdom into it, and even if they were there, but just to have a context.
Yeah.
And I wasn't planning to, I mean, unless you want to say something about that. But and I wasn't planning to say this, but then you were talking about the last comment that you were made in referencing, in responding to Scott's comment about, you used the word animalistic. So it just made me think of the previous Parashah, where Yaakov is using all these animal words in the, I'll use the word brachot, or all the different verses that he's saying to his sons, but he's using all those animal words. So that's interesting that's coming up again in this parasha.
Yeah, I love that thought. Very, very relevant and interesting, sort of reminding us the way the same kinds of speech tools or metaphors, images can be used, for or against, or have different valences depending on the speaker and the context. I think it's a lovely contrast of sorts. Great. Dad?
To go back to what Dara was saying about last week's Parsha, when Yaakov compares his sons to different animals, I don't think any of them are reptiles. I think there's lion and wolf. I mean, they're strong animals. They're not the creepy crawly as you described them.
What about Don?
Was he a serpent or a snake?
Is he a serpent? I think so.
Oh, okay. Well, there.
With one notable exception. Yes, good. No, I think that's interesting. Yeah, and maybe a serpent is, I don't know, little different, although they certainly do slither. Yeah, good point.
One other aside. There was a quote there that no slave ever left Egypt. So I think Moment magazine is having a speaker sometime soon, the author of a book about one of the 4 people who escaped from Auschwitz, from that however many millions of people who went through that terrible place. Only 4 people escaped.
Wow. Thank you. All right, let's go on a little further. Since we're not going to see the whole thing no matter what, I'm going to actually just skip the next section. Please feel free to read it on your own, the anonymity and silence, because I want to get to a little bit about the notion of seeing, which I think is very significant. So just jumping ahead a little bit to the midwives' rebellion. So they just in a word, this little section sort of talks about how the very beginning of Shemot, nobody has names and really nobody is speaking except for Paro. So again, that reminder which she used those 3 descriptions of Egypt: constriction, paralysis, and silence. So here the focus a little bit is on the silence for the moment. The first to speak back to Paro are the technicians of birth, the midwives. Emerging from the anonymous silent masses, ambiguous in their identity, here she quotes the classic question, the midwives are called mialadot ha'ivriot. We don't know whether that means the midwives to the Hebrews or the midwives who were Hebrews. So ambiguous in their identity, right? Midwives to the Hebrew women or Hebrew midwives. They are named right? One is Shifra and one is Pua, and involved in dialogue with Paro. What compels them to speak is their disobedience to Paro's decree. Paro's decree was, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it's a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. Paro's tone is the tone of Gezerah, edict, unequivocal, surgical in its categorization of possibilities. And her choice of the word surgical is also very intentional. We did a little bit of on Gezerah in one of the Vayikra essays. And there she noticed and talked about sort of the theme and idea of an edict as clear cut, literally cut, because the root ligzor also means to cut or to carve something. So when she calls this Gezerah or edict surgical in its categorization of possibilities, she's alluding to the additional semantic kind of dimension of the root ligzor, which means to cut surgically. The command is to kill. The alternative, in the case of a girl baby, is vachaya, let her be, let her live. The pivotal verb is look. Paro commands them to see difference, to analyze the situation in the very thrust of birth. Right? It says, Uriten al ha'ovnaim, look at the birth stool. This kind of seeing, boy/girl, death/life, is essential to the mode of gzerah, of edict. The word gzerah is in fact rooted in the verb, I forgot that she said this, says this, to cut, in the notion of separation, difference, analysis. The midwives' disobedience is described with an idiom that has never before appeared in the Torah in just this form. They feared God. We remember that Avraham, after he is released from the trial of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is called a God-fearing person, right? Now I know that Yirei Elokim ata, you are a God-fearing person. The midwives, however, enact fear of God, right? Vatirena hamiyaladot et Elohim. They do it, right? Meaning just that the fear of God appears now as a verb, not just as a God fear. I don't know if it's a participle or a noun form with Avraham. Using the verb form, they feared God, conveys the sense of a moral act that mobilizes the energy not to do what the Egyptian king had told them. They let the boys live. This act of fearing God, which generates life for the boy babies, is essentially a refusal to see as Paro sees, a refusal, that is, to see difference. Traditionally, they are understood to have nurtured the babies, providing them with food and water. This fear of God is a classic heroic response to the edicts of tyrants. As Or HaChaim suggests, the very extremity of the edict forces a new moral vision upon the midwives, a radical choice between life and death. And it sort of calls them, because of the gzerah sort of sense of stark difference, you can't sort of be in the middle. And so they have a kind of a radical choice, which leads to a radical disobedience. Disobedience to Paro becomes more than merely a refusal to kill. It becomes a total dedication to nourishing life. Here, I think she's explaining, why does Rashi say, that they nurtured the babies? Because Rashi's sort of picking up on this theme that there's no middle ground. You're being told to kill and you're not killing, then you are all in on life. The narrative has conveyed, in mid-flight, as it were, the very moment of fearing God, its free assumption of responsibility. Paro then reproaches them, not with negligence, but with preserving life. And it is at this point that the first words of resistance in Exodus are spoken. Against the absurd reproach of Paro, why have you done this thing and kept the children alive? Against the unself-conscious brutality of Paro's implicit question, why life? They answer, the Hebrew women, are vigorous, ki chayotena, they're lively. Before the midwife can come to them, they have given birth. In terms of the Hebrew idioms used, their answer is, these women are alive, right? That's sort of chayotena. Before the birth aid can come, they give birth. Some radical, irreducible confrontation is marked in these first words against Paro. To speak against the gezerah is in a real sense impossible. The only appropriate response to a gezerah is silence within the framework of a gezerah. You can't speak against it. To utter words is to create an alternative world, a world of undifferentiated life. This is indeed the claim of the Hebrew midwives. The Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. An alternative realm to Paro's Egyptian realm is sketched in their words. In this Hebrew women's world, life and birth happen irrepressibly. So here she's trying to, I think, further develop, going back to that very beginning theme, this, she's asking the question, how do you get out of Egypt? And Egypt and Israel are antitheses of one another. So what is it to be an Israelite, which needs to in some way be formed in order to differentiate and then exit Egypt? And in some way it has to happen in Egypt, even though it's also sort of impossible to do that. And so one of the first points she's suggesting here is kind of tying back to this notion of the fertility. It's this sort of life irrepressibility, even though in the one sense for the Sforno, this was being read negatively. Now I think she's circling back to a positive reading of it as this, again, irrepressible quality that differentiates the Hebrews from the Egyptians. We want to do one more slightly long section, then we'll conclude. Moshe's early life. Paro's next move is to command the public murder of boy babies. They are to be thrown in the river. And the next words spoken are those of Paro's daughter when she opens the casket where the infant Moses is hidden. Again, we're still sort of now on this theme of when does speech happen as against the otherwise silent, anonymous, nameless beginning of the book. Her words are not apparently expressive of any particular emotion. So she opens the casket where the infant Moses is hidden. This must be a Hebrew child. Her words are not apparently expressive of any particular emotion, simply a phrase of identification. The baby's sister hears her words as she waits at a distance to know what would befall him, talking about, Miriam, as she's described in the beginning of chapter 2. She immediately enters into a conversation with the princess about a wet nurse for the baby. She brings her mother, who is commissioned to nurse her own child. This passage, with its detailed discussion of the nursing arrangements for the infant Moses, seems unnecessarily florid in a narrative that is otherwise quite sparing of detail. However, although apparently of purely technical interest, this passage, which is with its short practical interchanges between women, focuses our attention on the necessities of life. What is needed for the survival of the infant in a culture of death is not simply a private maternal breast. The child cannot be hidden beyond the earliest phase of life, but a discourse between those who are moved to dangerous words about nurturance. This is a conspiracy of three women who return the baby to the mother's breast, its natural place. Only by speaking of nursing does this most natural function become possible. From the princess's viewpoint, this is clearly a nursing for me. Take this child and nurse it for me. The wet nurse is serving as an aid to her in her desire to bring life out of the destructive waters. This episode turns, we've been talking about how speech, again, against the edict, speech is sort of what breaks forth and changes, and it's also more than speech, it's action. Speech as sort of generating life. This episode, now we're going to come back, though, to a different verb. This episode turns, we notice, on a specific way of seeing. The princess saw the basket among the reeds. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy crying. The next episode gives us Moses' first significant act as an adult, also in terms of a way of seeing. Sometime after that, when Moshe had grown up, right, he went out to his kinsfolk and saw their burdens. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brothers. He turned this way and that. All the language of Ra'ah. He saw that no one was about, and he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. Moses had grown up. By the way, this little next three sentences, I think, are really a lovely insight. This is the second use of the verb. The first, in the previous verse, had indicated a process of development ended in weaning, and in the princesses, assuming the maternal role. But that was verse 10. Moshe's growing up is happening in quick succession. First, he grows up and is weaned and is brought to, the princess, as she's called here, and then he grows up further and goes out amongst his people and sees what's going on with him. Now, again, a phase of growth is indicated in his emergence from the palace to see the suffering of his brothers. The phases of growth have a paradoxical symmetry. To become gadol, great or grown, that's the verb in both places, vayigdal, means to come to the end of a stage of development, to become capable of confronting new experiences. I think there's a beautiful kind of reading of the term gadol. We normally think about gadol as culmination and conclusion. You grew up, The idea of growing up here to become gadol is to become ready to enter a new stage, to start something new. It's not an end as much as a beginning. Moses leaves his birth mother, the nursing breast, and moves to the princess's palace. Moses later leaves that palace and is able, strangely, to recognize in the brutalized slaves outside his own brothers. He saw their sufferings, what they had to bear, the weight of their existence. Rashi comments, he gave his eyes and his heart to be distressed over them. Moses' seeing is Moses allowing himself to be affected, to suffer with those who are unexpectedly called his brothers. This kind of seeing is contrasted with the seeing essential to Paro's edict. Now we're coming full circle of this inner circle. Look at the birth stool. Paro's seeing was a seeing of disjunction and difference, while Moses' first significant act of maturity is an act of empathy with those who seem physically, socially, and existentially so different from him. He looks at those crushed under Egyptians' burdens with what, I don't know if this is George or Jorge, Sempron calls a pure fraternal gaze. It is on the basis of that vulnerable empathy that he then sees the Egyptian taskmaster battering one of his brothers, sees that as the axis of difference, now running between those who inflict cruelty and those who suffer it. It is then, for the third time, that he sees that there was no one about and struck down the Egyptian, vayach, the same verb that as described the Egyptian striking the Hebrew. This third seeing conveys the unavoidable responsibility to act on the basis of a complex empathy. This is a hard place to stop because the next section is also very important, but you do have it, and I encourage you to read on because then she goes, as she often does, and carries a theme, a literary theme from the text into midrashic / commentary text, and shows how Rashi picks up on this question of how people are seen around a question of Moses's wonderings about the worthiness of the people to be redeemed, which circles us back to the sort of the Sfornos question. Are they, have they done something wrong or not? At the moment that Moses is empathizing with them, he also starts to ask the question, are they worthy to be redeemed? What would make them worthy to be redeemed? And that's sort of the direction that the essay continues on in, but we're close to time. So again, we didn't get to answer all the questions, but hopefully we saw, I think some important questions, some, really key literary ideas. Just going back, this the question of what is the identity of Egypt and how can Israel emerge from Egypt? The local reading of sort of the question of this description of their fertility, a positive reading, a negative reading, an analysis of the Sforno's negative reading. What would motivate such a negative reading in light of the fact that we already have a foretelling, if not an explanation, for the servitude and suffering in Egypt? Why would the Sforno want to attribute it to Israelite wrongdoing? And along the way, just saw those two divergent approaches to the Israelites' activity in Egypt over those two generations, assimilation versus separation. And then came around sort of to delve into the Egypt experience and how do they start to differentiate themselves in Egypt, and the notion of kind of speaking up out of the silence, speaking up, affirming life, and then around the question of sort of seeing in order to connect as opposed to seeing difference, and seeing in order to empathize, as sort of a turning point. And again, in the theme of not difference, it's, I think we've already seen twice with the midwives and with the princess or Bat Paro, that even though she opens up with this sort of sense of Egyptians versus Israelites, it's not quite so stark as that. We could consider Bat Paro almost an Israelite who's acting like an Egyptian who's acting more like an archetypal Israelite, or the midwives also as sort of occupying an intermediate space between these two. So it's not, Egypt and Israel almost become archetypes more than just, national titles. And I think, again, that's important to the Tanakh all throughout. When it says, about the Jewish people, don't follow the ways of the Egyptians, it recognizes that just by virtue of being born Israelite, doesn't free us from the dangers of Egyptian behavior. And already here embedded in the story, we see from the very beginning, there are Egyptians who behave outside of the framework of what the criticized Egyptian approach is. So even, always I feel even while these are describing nations, when they become pulled out as sort of archetypes or metaphors, we see the limits, that it's not, everybody isn't painted with one brush, and just because you're born into one community doesn't mean you automatically adopt, for better and for worse, the qualities of that community. So a lot to open up with. Any questions or comments before we wrap up? Lance, we haven't heard from you. Go for it.
My question is this: why doesn't Moses kill Pharaoh? James Bond would.
What would be the motivation? Meaning in order to release the Israelites, because figuring like Allah, why has no one assassinated Putin kind of thing? Meaning he's the mastermind, and why not just go straight to the top?
Yep.
Always a good question. Why has no one assassinated Putin?
One other point I'd like to make is that the description, first of all, I thought the comparison to the extermination was really on target. But I think that you have two Egypts, and they're two radically different Egypts. You have two books, and Genesis is radically different from Exodus. They're two totally different gods, and the problem that I have here is really that you have the Assyrians in the background, and I think that the Egyptians in Exodus are really an avatar for the Assyrians. The Assyrians are, Ashurbanipal is somebody who literally skins his enemies alive. He's a really miserable human being. And it seems to me that what really is going on here, what's always going on here, is a conflict between the Assyrians and the Samaritans. And I have a hunch, which I cannot prove, no way, that there is a Samaritan Torah, not the Samaritan Torah that we supposedly have, which is word for word equal to the Rabbinic Torah. But there's got to be some kind of prequel or something like that. And I would just point out my good buddy, the prophet Nahum, which is hardly mentioned anywhere in Jewish liturgy. But Nahum is someone who goes against repentance. In other words, he says Jonah is someone who's on his team. And what Jonah says is the people in Nineveh ain't gonna repent. They might say they are, but they ain't gonna. And sure enough, I believe historically they didn't. But the point is that if you compare Nahum to whoever wrote Exodus, you're going to find Nahum is, carpet bomb, take no prisoners, Carthage, all that sort of thing. And unfortunately, we have a world in which, for example, the Israelis, Israel is, U.S. News and World Report, the 8th most powerful country in the world. They could destroy, Gaza in a few minutes, but they don't, because they're afraid that the world might say something, or they're limited. And it seems to me that all this talk about the far right is really missing the point. And I think that what's going on in Exodus, unfortunately, is this attempt to rely on magic. In other words, we're going to have a burning bush. We're going to have frogs and lice and darkness and all this stuff, tricks. And that's going to win. That's going to do it. And that just doesn't wash for me.
There. Thank you. Good deep readings. All right, off we go. Great to be started. And I a reminder that next week, because of MLK Day, we'll have an abbreviated session. We're going to start late at 9 o'clock, and we'll keep it tight as possible as that is with Dr. Aviva Zornberg, and we'll send an excerpt ahead of time. So great to see everybody. Love to mom and dad and to all. Good night.